Good evening to you, Mr. Babones. Must be late evening if you're in Sydney, or have you moved to the US for a while?
No, I'm here in Sydney, and it's a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Babones. Let's begin with the Quad first, because Australia is part of it, and it seems whatever hesitations Australia had of Quad, about Quad, and balancing between adjusting with the rise of China and to be seen in a certain camp like the Quad, seems to have vanished. And Australia also is now very clear that its destiny and future lies with Quad as a grouping. And it's becoming clear that the leadership in Australia has decided that the manner in which China is conducting itself is not good for the Committee of Nations. Do you get that sense from Quad and the takeaways that have come out by way of the joint statement of Quad this evening?
I'm sorry to disappoint, but I think that's a very rose-tinted view of what the Quad is and could be doing. In fact, Australia and the United States have dropped out of the Quad to such an extent that we might as well call it the duo. It really is an India and Japan show. Let me just read you the only coverage that there has been in the Australian press of the Quad was in the Australian newspaper. And I'll just read you their leader on it. The Quadrilateral Leaders Summit in Delaware has broadcast a loud and resounding message of weakness, timidity, irresolution, and pervasive lameness. Or when you go to the U.S. coverage, the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal have literally not covered the meeting. At least as of 1 hour ago, they had not published a single story relating to the Delaware Quad meeting. The New York Times covered it and sent their health reporter. And the lead story on the New York Times coming out of the Quad was the battle against cervical cancer in Pacific Island countries. In Australia and the United States, the Quad has really been castrated to the point where it is viewed simply as a grouping that can't be discontinued because it would be embarrassing to do so, but one in which they're not willing to confront China in a muscular way, the same way that India and Japan are prepared to do.
Is this just a media impression there in the United States and Australia? Because if you look at all the statements coming in from the establishments, both in the US and Australia, they're fully backing Quad. And in fact, the Biden administration has made it sort of a keystone of its foreign policy insofar as the Indo-Pacific is concerned.
You have to read between the lines. They say they fully support the Quad, but the Quad never mentions China. The Quad says that it is not directed against any particular country. And on top of that, remember 4 years ago when we had different leadership in both Australia and the United States, the Quad was actively discussing joint fleet operations and the creation of a new combined fleet to be based in Australia with naval units from each of the 4 partners. That conversation is long gone. If you read the Quad communique that just came out, it is overwhelmingly about development cooperation in Pacific Island states, about cancer and health initiatives, about working with Gavi, the Global Vaccine Alliance. Of course, there is a mention of free and open Indo-Pacific, and there is a mention of cooperation to keep the sea lanes open, but that's simply not where the political emphasis is. And I think the U.S. newspapers are very well aware that for this outgoing administration, now we don't know what Kamala Harris might bring in if she were to become president, but for this outgoing administration, the Quad is just something that has to happen, not something that they're really willing to put any oomph behind.
All right, so it could be because in many ways the present leadership of Quad, except for Prime Minister Narendra Modi, is sort of on its way out. Definitely President Biden and Prime Minister Kishida. But also, I believe, in the case of Prime Minister Albanese, he has to seek a re-election in the first quarter of 2025. So maybe that could have that could have had some bearing on the manner in which the press in respective countries handled it. But fact of the matter is, Mr. Babones, that there is a lot that's happening in Quad, which clearly, irrespective of whether China is named or not, by actions, definitely contains and puts some spokes in the wheel so far as Chinese belligerence is concerned. For example, the announcement in the statement yesterday, or today morning, of carrying out joint patrols by the coast guards, respective coast guards of the Quad countries, and to make sure that the sea lanes are free. Obviously, there is direct messaging to China, so nobody should be saying that China is not the elephant in the room, or there is no acknowledgement of the same fact.
Look, I want the Quad to be more robust just as much as you seem to want it to be more robust. But the fact is that here in Australia, Anthony Albanese has been working very hard for the last 2.5 years to repair relations with China. He's recently traveled to China. He's sought to end unofficial Chinese embargoes on Australian seafood and other imports. He has been doing everything possible to make friends with China, not trying to, he's been absolutely studiously avoided any aggressive language vis-a-vis China. Now, the U.S. Biden administration has not quite gone that far, but Joe Biden made it clear when he was first elected in January 2021 that he wanted to refocus the Quad away from maritime security and towards issues like health cooperation, technology cooperation, people-to-people relations. Now, these are, I think, strategic missteps by both countries, but really the Quad has become a duo. It is pushed forward by Japan and India, and hopefully the administrations in the U.S. and Australia will eventually catch up. Whoever wins the U.S. election, hopefully come January, will reinvigorate the Quad and make it a true defense grouping, and whoever wins the Australian election next year, I would hope would do the same.
All right, and since Prime Minister Narendra Modi happens to be in the US and he's going to be addressing the Indian diaspora in a while from now, Mr. Babones, and since you have effectively turned into an Indologist, how do you see the visit of Prime Minister panning out in New York over the next 2 days?
Mr. Modi has made a real effort to connect with the Indian diaspora in the United States, and he's been extremely successful at doing so. It's very telling that Rahul Gandhi, of course, recently made a trip to the U.S., but most of his time seems to have been spent not speaking to the diaspora, but instead speaking to elite American groups, NGOs, political groups, academic groups, whereas when Mr. Modi goes, he wants to talk to ordinary people. I think that difference in style is very obvious. The other is for people to decide whether they think their political leaders should mainly talk to ordinary people or mainly talk to intellectual elites. But the differences between the Gandhi U.S. trip and the Modi U.S. trip, I think, will be very strikingly obvious to anyone who watches them.